Hey, y'all, happy Friday. This is May 1st, and I know there's some adjustments made in the state of Texas as to the reopen, and I hope you're adjusting properly and well while staying safe and leaning into the Lord. And actually, our text today, which is a lengthy one, but it's so fast moving, there's so much action. It's typical of Mark, and it's typical of this section from the beginning of chapter 4 really through chapter 6. There is just so much going on here. Uh, I was thinking when I was reading through this section again, at the end of chapter 4, we saw Jesus was asleep in the stern of the boat as it crossed from the northwest to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. And I was thinking, this is the only time that Jesus has to rest because there are crowds around him nonstop. There is ministry demanded of him nonstop. And if you know the theological, anthropological, that's fully God and fully man nature of Jesus, you know that the fully man needs to rest. We see him sitting down to rest, uh, needing rest in John chapter 4 too, when he sat down at the well while he sent his posse in to get food. And so I was thinking that this trek across the lake between ministry assignments is the only time he gets to sleep, because I don't see any other time in this section for sure. And while the Gospels aren't a full chronology or biography of Jesus, there are enough cues here to recognize that Jesus' mission is to show the world who God is through his teaching and his ministry of miracles of a diverse sort. And so, as we come to our text today, we're going to close out the rapid fire action of chapter 5. And I called this section Risky Business because there are two extreme risk takers in this section. I mean, they are taking risks that are extreme. And they're also extreme in their position and place in Jewish society and Jewish culture. And so, Risky Business is a story of two individuals who, although coming from diverse backgrounds, they are common and singular in their need to take these risks that are extreme. And so, these risk takers, one is a prominent member of the society in the area, and the other is an outcast. And so they couldn't be more polar in their position. But what they have in common is they are desperate, needy, and suffering beyond their ability to remedy. And that has some echoes for our current situation. But I'm going to offer, as I move through this section and then get to some application, that there is a desperate need for us to have a remedy for a suffering that's beyond our ability or control to remedy also. And so let's get right into the story. Uh, Mark 5, verses 21 through 43, we see risk taker number one, and then we see in this interlude, while Jesus is saying yes to risk taker number one, we see risk taker number two injected into the story as well. So, risk taker number one, what's at stake here is status and position, possibly even more, possibly even legal action, or maybe even a death. So when Jesus had crossed over again, you remember yesterday in the healing of the man in the Decapolis that was among the tombs, as soon as they got out of the boat, this man who was possessed uh, came and cried out for remedy, another desperate, needy soul. Jesus heals him, casts out his demons, puts them into the pigs, and the people of the area ask him to leave. And so he does. So he crossed over from the northwest to the northeast, came out, who knows how long he was planning to be there, immediately because of his priority to heal and to serve. He serves this man towards healing, and he's asked to leave. And he gets back in the boat with a posse and goes back to the northwest side And here we are. He crosses back over 21 when he had crossed again over by boat to the other side of the lake. A large crowd, and this is now the theme. This is the norm. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. Now it's important for us to pause here and recognize who this man is. He is a synagogue leader, meaning he is a leader in the local church, the local gathering of Jewish religious goods and services, commissioned by the religious leaders of the land, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, to be an important figure in the local church. If we were to look at it from a modern Western megachurch construct, this guy is the pastor, the satellite campus pastor for the large temple mother church. And so, as such, he would have been informed both by his religious leaders who were local and in Jerusalem, and also just by stories and testimonies of what Jesus is doing in the area. He would know and be instructed to not allow any influence, nuance of Jesus or his posse to invade the religious culture of the area. So he would have been cast as an enemy of Jesus, just like the rest of the religious leaders. If you remember in our story in chapter 2, at the end of Jesus' 5 consecutive confrontations, they began to plan and plot with the civil and governmental leaders how to put Jesus to death. So this guy would have been on the side of those conspiring to put Jesus to death. So what's happening here that is now forcing him outside of his status and position and his instructed role that drives him to Jesus? A man named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. So this is the approach of desperate submission. And he pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying." And so now we begin to see how desperate need beyond control of remedy drives us outside of our normal, comfortable, relied upon status and into the world of seeking help beyond our ability. He pleaded earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So the stories of Jesus are now embedded in the northern region, Galilee, and then the Decapolis and Nazareth. And so Jairus knows, regardless of what he's been told in his necessary approach or shunning of Jesus, he knows that there's something resident in Jesus that he must beg for in order to possibly save his daughter. "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Verse 24, so Jesus went. It's important to know, I don't want to make it walk on all fours, but it's important to note that an approach of desperate submission will always elicit Jesus' participation. Because there's a huge crowd here, but there are only a few, and in this story, a couple of people who are desperate enough to take the risks of submitting themselves to Jesus. So Jesus went with him. William Barclay, a commentator that I talk about often, says this about Jairus. This story tells us something about this man who was the ruler of the synagogue. He must have been a person of some considerable importance. The ruler of the synagogue was the administrative head. He was the president of the board of elders responsible for the management of the synagogue. He was responsible for the conduct of the services. He did not usually take part in them himself. This is why I love Barclay. He gives us such rich context in the historical setting of the day. But he was responsible for the allocation of the duties of the synagogue and seeing they were all carried out in good order. The ruler of the synagogue was one of the most important and respected men in the community. And Barclay follows, and I've sort of customized this language. But a couple of things happened to Jairus when his daughter fell ill, and Jesus came into the area. First of all, his prejudices were cast aside. There's no doubt that Jairus was instructed and even commanded to see Jesus as an outsider and a dangerous heretic. But those prejudices were scraped when the possibility of Jesus being able to help his daughter were raised. And then secondly, he crucified his pride. It must have taken, I'm just constructing language here. It must have taken a conscious effort of personal humiliation for this icon of the community, this leader of the synagogue, to come and ask for help from a wandering preacher who was seen by his own tribe as dangerous and blasphemous. So here's Jairus, the first risk taker, risking literally all, because people in the town that are part of this crowd, they know his position, and they know the religious communities stand on Jesus. And so for him to humble himself before everyone speaks of this deepest, desperate desire for Jesus to help. And so on the way, you see, he asked in submission, Jesus went with him. And so on the way, we're now at the end of verse 24. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And here's our second risk taker. And a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. A woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, we would say that's a shame, but it's worse than a shame in Jewish culture. This woman would have been an outcast. A Jewish law mandated that anyone who had this sort of issue of blood, any kind of discharge, as well as the lepers, any kind of skin condition, we saw that in a previous healing, must remain outside the camp. Now, that is a term in scare quotes that means shunned by society until it's proven that that issue is healed, whether it be an issue and a discharge from the internal or an external skin condition. So she was ceremonially unclean outside the camp and outside of life. And here she is in the midst of this throng, in this crowd, in this city, in this area of population density, now drawn to Jesus as his fame grows. So she's outside the camp and outside of life. The text says, and this is kind of funny, and this might find a home in our contemporary thinking. Verse 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. And so I looked at the original language because I thought that it might be just an English nuancing that makes it seem like the ones who are supposed to be healing her are actually adding to her suffering. But this is the way the text is constructed. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. So not only was her health waning, but her wealth was draining. Her health and her wealth were now at an ebb. They were done. And she was desperate. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Many doctors spending all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him. So she's in this crowd, and it's probable that she could be easily recognized as someone who had been outside the camp and then forgotten and shunned. She's now working her way through this crowd where people would know her. So I see her with her hood over her head and her head down as she makes a beeline for Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. 12 years of painful uncertainty, her health draining, her wealth gone. And now in her desperation, she seeks Jesus by faith with a touch of trust. At once, verse 30, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around. There's so much in here that's just amazing from a historical and literary construction. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Verse 31. This is one of the few times you see sort of a little pushback from his posse, from his disciples. "You see the people crowding against you," the disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?' Because everyone is touching you." And it's true. I mean, this is a jostling. This is like bumper cars as the throng moves, still on mission for Jairus' daughter. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And they're his disciples who were trying to protect him. They're like the bodyguards. They're trying to like make a way. Hey, make a window, make a hole. They're like, "Everyone's touching you. How can you ask such a thing?" But not everyone is contacting Jesus in the same attitude. But Jesus kept looking around, verse 32, to see who had done it, who had touched him. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. Again, another approach, but this lady is on the right side of her miracle. While Jesus was still, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. Now I want to pause right here. Sometimes when you're reading your Bible and you read this narrative, you read this story, and in this particular case, when you read that the woman had been suffering this issue of blood for 12 years and no doctors could help and her wealth was gone, you start to think, well, how did anybody know that? Because all we see in the text is she touched his clothes and she was healed. This is where you see that this story was told. She came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. So this is where the story comes out, and this is how it's being recorded for now writing in this gospel record, this good news record of Jesus' life. He said to her, "Daughter," and this is the only time Jesus addresses someone in this manner, in this parental manner, as he's ministering or teaching or contacting. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Now I just want to pause, and I'd like to just be inside of that story. So you have Jairus, who has asked Jesus to heal his daughter because she's at the end. That's literally what he says. "My daughter is barely holding on. Will you come and lay your hands on her?" And now on the way, he might have seen it as like a, hey, you're wasting valuable time. And then Jesus calls this woman daughter. And I wonder what was going on in Jairus' thinking at that point. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go and be in peace. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Go and that expression, "go in peace," literally means be steeped in this settledness and be freed from your suffering. Verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. You see how Mark continues to emphasize this man's position and how naturally it should be over and against Jesus' mission? That's very purposeful. It's to cast alongside in the natural this hostility, but in the desperation of Jairus' condition, all those walls are torn down. While Jesus was still speaking, verse 35, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And at this point, Jesus begins to winnow the crowd, and even from his own disciples, even from his posse. He selects 3 to go with him into the next level of this mission. Verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. So what was happening here is, if you have to know the culture, and this is why it's so enriching to understand what's going on in the ancient Near East, and here in particular in the tradition of dealing with death. There are paid mourners already at work. There's actually, it's a cottage industry. I don't know any other way to put it. That when there's a local death, there are local people who are paid to come, and this is rooted in Old Testament law and Old Testament expression of dealing with death. There are people who are paid to come in and be your professional mourners. So they're already at work here. And that, typically what that means is they would be weeping and wailing. I mean loud. They'd be singing and they'd have musical instruments and they'd be clapping in their mourning. Jesus went in, verse 39, and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing?" He's like, "Psst, we've seen that before. Psst. This child is not dead, but asleep." And if you didn't know what's going on, that these are professionals who are being paid to do what they do, and he's telling them to stop, so their payment is at risk. They mocked him. They laughed. It says in the NIV that I'm reading from, verse 40, they laughed at him. But this is not humor. This is mocking. It's like, yeah, right. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the 3 disciples who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum." Now, this is one of the few times in the Gospels that you see what we call the ipsis verbum, the very words that Jesus spoke, because we have the language now translated into English for us, but this is the Aramaic Talitha cum, and it's given to us. We see that also as Jesus hangs on the cross, when we see him saying, "It is finished." We see the original Aramaic in there as well. So this is called the ipsis verbum. When he's hanging on the cross, it's te telestai, the original language, te telestai. It is finished. Which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. A couple of interesting things here. This is going a little longer today. Stay with me. I hope you find this encouraging, enriching. But there's a couple of things going on here. At 12 years old, she is on the threshold of the bat mitzvah, which means the threshold of becoming a woman. For a boy, it's the bar mitzvah. For the girl, it's the bat mitzvah. So she's right here on the threshold of moving into this confirmation of adulthood. And also, I find it interesting that the woman who was healed in her desperation suffered for 12 years from this issue of blood. I don't know if there's anything to it. I just found it interesting. Talitha cum, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. At this, they were completely astonished. So the word here, astonished, means absolutely dumbfounded, speechless. It's like someone came and took a miracle 2x4 and hit him upside the head. And they have this cognitive dissonance. Here was death now turned to life with a handout and a command, Talitha cum. And Jesus gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. All this verifies for me the historical veracity, the truthfulness of this narrative. Again, in verse 43, strict orders. Jesus is on the Jewish side of the culture, and he wants to make sure that he, as much as possible, is not overriding the expressions of the law necessary to confirm this miracle. But it is indeed a miracle. Isn't that crazy? What an amazing, astonishing miracle 2x4 to the head as we walk this road from the side of the lake to Jairus' house. And we see 2 diverse risk takers, but they had one thing in common. They both, in humility, acknowledged that Jesus' feet reached out a hand of faith and trust, knowing he was the only remedy to their desperate need. See, that's authentic faith, humble faith, trusting faith. And so there's just a few things I wanted to glean from this, and there's so much more. This whole section could be a series on its own. But authentic faith springs from desperate need. Authentic faith springs from desperate need. If I don't truly acknowledge my desperation, I can't express authentic faith, because authentic faith is a trust and a confidence in the one who can supply the remedy for the need that's out of my control to remedy. Authentic faith springs from desperate need. Another thing I learned from this story is that authentic faith rightly devalues the affirmation of the crowd or the confirmation of the world. We see in Jairus' case, his position in the world must be devalued for him to come off of the false construct of his status as synagogue leader to express an authentic faith in the one he knew could heal his daughter. And the woman with the issue of blood, she had to rightly shun what she knew would be spoken of her by the crowd, and made her way directly to Jesus so she could reach out a hand of trusting authentic faith. So authentic faith rightly devalues the affirmation of the crowd and rightly devalues the confirmation of the status of the world. And then finally, and this is where I want to broaden the application and make sure that we find its place in us, because we are all desperately in need of what Jesus provides. We have this sin disease that has killed us and is killing us. We are dead spiritually without him. Our physical bodies are deteriorating because of sin, and there's no ability of my own to remedy that. I cannot cure my spiritual separation from God, and I cannot cure the physical degradation of my body that sin is wreaking havoc on. But Jesus has promised that if I approach him in humble submission and reach out an authentic hand of faith, that he will take me by the hand and say, I command you to arise. And that was proven in his own death, burial, and rising again from the dead. Jesus arose. Therefore, we trust him when he holds out his hand and takes us and says, my son, my daughter, arise. Have you expressed an authentic faith to Jesus? Humble, submitted affirmation of Jesus as your only remedy for a desperate need that's beyond your ability to cure. Hope you have a great weekend.